Well, so, okay, although we are a very small select group and we almost all know each other by now, I still want to officially welcome Dr. Wim Peumans. Came all the way from Belgium here, although he is actually working in South Africa. So Dr. Peumans did his study at the Catholic University of Leuven. For you, those of you who know, in Belgium, it's the Oxford of Belgium, you can say. Did his PhD there on a topic relating to the anthropology of sexuality within religious minorities, specifically in this case Muslims. He has completed a manuscript on queer Muslims to be coming out next year with Taurus. I think they are based in London, Taurus, in their Islam and Gender Studies series. So this is all very fortunate for us to have you here and talk about something you really know an awful lot about. And although we are select small group, we are very excited and very interested to hear what you say. So please take it away.
Okay. So I want to start my talk today with an ethnographic vignette, a small a small description of my fieldwork. An autumn evening in 2012, I am sitting at the bar of the LGBT Rainbow House in Brussels with 2 men and 2 women. All born in Belgium, the men and women have ancestral roots in Morocco or Turkey. The men drink beer and the women water. They talk about how people who grew up there arrive in a totally different world here in Belgium and the difficulties their parents have to step out of their own frames of reference, and about how they themselves grew up between what they call 2 different worlds, 2 cultures. Sure, Brahim tells me and the others, you grew up with your parents within the culture they have been given at home and in Morocco, but apart from that, you live in Belgian society, at school, with your friends, where different norms and values exist, and this clashes. Muna, the young woman sitting next to Brahim, is fiddling with her hands and shows the henna drawings on her left hand. She tells everyone her sister got married last weekend. That is why I have all these questions. Brahim tells her his coming out story and about his decision to break with his parents. He says it is a choice you have to make at a certain moment. For me, it became unbearable. I was waiting for some sort of acceptance that would never come. I had to break with them so I could breathe. Was it emotionally difficult? Yes. Was it intellectually speaking the only solution? Yes. It was very hard, I will not lie about it, but I did not have any other choice. Brahim drinks from his beer before he continues. Each time I visited my parents, I tried to sneak in little pieces of my life into the conversation. Like I would say I was going to the Netherlands with a friend. And then I would look for some recognition in my mother's eyes, but it never came. I was just wasting my time. Muna talks about how she left her home to live on her own, which was already difficult. She lives in her own flat, but she is afraid because she has no idea how her parents will react to a disclosure of her sexuality. Because her sister got married, she got a lot of questions about when she will get married. She tried to make clear to her mother that marriage is not her thing. But this did not go down well. What do I do? She wonders. As a woman, you are the face of the family. As a woman, it is even harder to refuse this. Moments later, she talks about having a girlfriend for the past 6 months and the difficulties they experience. I'm leading a double life, and it is like my girlfriend does not always understand me. Youssef agrees while avoiding eye contact with me. He says, no, Europeans, they do not understand. You try to explain to them that you cannot come out to your family, but they do not see the problem. So using this particular part of my fieldwork, or this ethnographic vignette, as we say in anthropology, as my starting point, I want to look at the multiple and ambivalent ways in which queer men and women with a Muslim background navigate queer men and women from third and second generation navigate silence and disclosure in the negotiation and performance of sexuality in everyday life. And specifically, I look at kin relations. Or to put it in more plain terms, do they come out to their family members, and how does this happen? So in the paper I'm presenting today, I'm drawing from an ethnographic research project on same-sex sexualities, transnational migration and religion, in which I specifically worked with lesbians, gays and bisexuals with a Muslim background. I focused on two different groups. On the one hand, I interviewed 17 sexual migrants, so these are people who migrated because of their sexuality to Belgium. And on the other hand, I interviewed 14 people from second and third generation migrant backgrounds. So their parents came to Belgium between the 1950s and 1980s in search of a job or a better way of life. So I used several research methods. So first, as I said, I used ethnographic interviews. So I did 65 ethnographic interviews. So most participants were interviewed at least once. Apart from that, I also interviewed gatekeepers, so people who are involved in LGBT associations. I also, so most of the interviews, or large majority, were done face-to-face, but apart from that, I also did a few online asynchronous interviews or email interviews. So one of the ways I tried to find participants was through dating websites, and I was always very open about my intentions there. But some people I met through these dating websites did not want to meet in person, so in this case I gave them the opportunity to be interviewed via email, but this was only with 2 people. Now, because of the very highly sensitive nature of the topic, participant observation was only done in the activities of LGBTQ associations and the LGBTQ scene in general in 3 cities in Belgium, Brussels, Antwerp, and the provincial capital of Hasselt. Additionally, I also asked participants to maintain a diary in which they reflected about everyday affairs concerning religion and sexuality. And in the end, I received 7 of those diaries, which was not as successful as I had hoped. But still, the diaries that I received were highly insightful. Of course, in much LGBT research, women are conspicuously underrepresented. So I put a great deal of effort to include women in the project. As a result of these efforts, 40% of the people in the sexual migrant group were cisgendered female, and 50% of the second and third generation group were also female. Now today, as I said, I only focus on the experiences of those of second and third generation. So let me talk about the context, because I find it always important to contextualize research. Of course, most of you, I presume, know Belgium of 3 things it is most famous for: fries, so Belgian fries, chocolate, and beer. And maybe you also know the national symbol, which is a peeing guy. Historically, Belgium is known as the battlefield of Europe, and still it remains the heart of Europe, as it is home to both European and intergovernmental institutions. And the border between Germanic and Roman Europe runs right through the country, which makes it an interesting place to do fieldwork. It has 3 official languages: Dutch, which is spoken in the Flemish north, and to a much lesser extent in Brussels, in the capital. French is spoken in the Wallonian, south, and then there's a small part in the east where German is spoken. Now, traditionally, Flanders has been more Catholic than free-thinking Wallonia. Historically, the Catholic Church was always very influential in moral debates, and it has always been a fierce opposition to any progress related to matters of sexuality, gender, and especially same-sex sexuality. But of course, as in other Western European countries, the Church's influence has been on the wane since the 1960s. And during my fieldwork, the Belgian Catholic Church went through one of its most severe crises in decades. In 2010, a wave of literally hundreds of children's abuse stories surfaced in the Belgian Catholic Church. And the lack of a decisive response on this issue by both the Catholic Church in Belgium and in Rome was very harmful for its public image. What did not help either was the attitude and the views of at the time then, the conservative Belgian Archbishop André-Joseph Léonard, who later in 2010 posited that AIDS is a form of imminent justice and that homosexuality is a wrongly understood form of sexuality. I'm quoting him now, obviously. The events of 2010 also led to a record number of over 6,000 disaffiliations from the Catholic Church. Now, internationally, Belgium has always had a dubious reputation. While it attracts not just tourists for its medieval villages, but also migrants in pursuit of an exceptionally high standard of living and also one of the best healthcare systems in the world, the country's image has been plagued throughout the past 2 or 3 decades. And its reputation of a country in a constant politically precarious balance was not helped by recent world-breaking federal coalition talks, and the previous world record was held by Iraq, just to give you an idea. And after recent terrorist attacks in Paris and Brussels, the Belgian capital gained the dubious honor of being the jihadi center of Europe. Now, since the 1960s, Belgium signed bilateral agreements with Morocco, Turkey, Algeria, and Tunisia to regulate and sustain the flow of guest workers, what was known at the time as guest workers. So migrants who came to Belgium to work in the industries and especially in mining. According to the latest estimates, 6% of the Belgian population is Muslim, and Islam was recognized as an official religion by the state in 1974. Now, with legislation that allows same-sex marriage and adoption by LGBT persons, and until 2014 we had a prime minister who was openly gay and the son of Italian immigrants, Belgium is often hailed as a progressive and modern European country. And many of the migrants I interviewed said that Belgium seemed like a land of milk and honey. Now, while the level of acceptance is unmistakably very high, men and women with same-sex desires are accepted under certain conditions. They have to behave straight, certainly not too overly sexual, and they have to conform to hegemonic gender norms. So, for my talk today, I want to look at how queer Muslims or queers with a Muslim background come out or do not come out to their families. And I'm interested what these results or these narratives teach us about common conceptions of silence, the closet, coming out, and disclosure. In popular, academic, and political thought, the gay or queer closet is not just seen as a mere characteristic of queer life, but it is a fundamental feature of its social life. And from the 1980s and 1990s, the closet and coming out were the main tropes through which queer life became imagined and represented. The closet and silence equal death, and disclosure equals happiness, life, personal fulfillment, and well-being. Yet already in the early 1990s, anthropologist Gilbert Hurt and others critiqued these common views of coming out as something that is uniform, stage-driven, ahistorical, that follows a certain teleological way of being or thinking. And sociologist Steven Seidman added that coming out is complicated by gender or generational difference. Still, he takes for granted that coming out should eventually happen. As he says, and I quote him here, "Coming out is approached as an initiation rite, marking a transition to an adult gay identity." End of quote. So, according to me, the theoretical blind spot here is that race, ethnicity, and class complicate disclosure and also question these concepts of coming out and the closet. Queer Muslims navigate different moralities concerning sexuality and gender, and some of these transgress national borders. We've seen this in the example I started my presentation with, where Brahim says, he talks about all these different worlds in which he grew up and how this often clashes. So he says like the home where he grew up, the school, the quarter of the city quarter where he lives, the LGBT scene. All these spaces have a slightly different set of moralities concerning gender and sexuality. And these different moralities inform the ways in which queer Muslims navigate silence and disclosure around sexual subjectivity. So, let us take a closer look to these different institutional moralities and public moral discourses. The first one is a heteronormative moral framework concerning the family. And again, I'm quoting or I'm drawing from anthropologist Gilbert Hurt, who coined the term of the heterosexual family myth to describe this set of practices and discourses. Now, when he uses the term myth, he doesn't imply that it's a fabrication or a fantasy, but he sees it in the anthropological sense of a cultural ideal, a guiding map which embodies a set of expectations for how one's life should unfold. The family, in ideal and ideological form, is heterosexual, monogamous, and childbearing. Now, this is not just a cultural ideal, but in the case of Muslims, it is also often a religious ideal and sometimes an obligation. Because within the Islamic tradition, sexual acts are only deemed possible between a man and a woman within the sacred institution of marriage. So, endogamy, or marrying within one's own ethnic or religious group, is in these cases encouraged, valued, and sometimes obligated. So the family as a unit is important in the context of transnational migration because the home is often one of the few spaces where practices and discourses of the homeland are intergenerationally passed on. So, sorry, it's easier if I'm so used to having my laptop here that it's... Anyway, so in my view, the family in the ethnic and religious communities in which my participants grew up, the family is not only important, as is often told, as a cultural thing or a religious thing, but that it also has to do precisely with this context of migration. So that their parents migrated to Belgium, that they have that their families are characterized with a degree of transnationalism. And this also informs, according to me, the importance of the family. And I give 3 reasons for that. That's because the family is one of the few places where practices and discourses of the ancestral homeland can be passed on. Also, I think that respect for elders is important because the parents often did a lot of sacrifice to provide their children with a better future. And this logic of sacrifice is often a central logic to a migration process. Also, migrants are often dependent on ethnic solidarity within a context of migration, especially in the beginning. For example, when they arrive, they are dependent on ethnic co-others or co-ethnic others. For example, to find a job, to know where to find housing, all these other things, and this creates a certain interdependence. Okay. Now, parents, of course, have hopes, dreams, and expectations for their children's future. and that particular future is always on the horizon during upbringing. Different moral expectations are imposed on both men and women. Morality is often more ambiguous for men than for women. And we've seen this in the example I gave in the beginning of my presentation, where Muna says, as a woman, you are the face of the family. And in this particular regard, psychologist Olivia Espin, who wrote one of the first books on transnational migration and sexuality, she claims that in the context of migration, women are often seen as the embodiment of cultural continuity and the moral guardians of the family. So when groups are determined to transform their way of life in a new context, women's roles become a very important focus of their attention. But as I said, these expectations around sex, gender, and sexuality, and particularly around premarital sex and the question of virginity, are also gendered. Because in reality, what we see from research is that young Muslim men have much more sexual experience before they step into matrimony than their female counterparts do. So, as I said, queer Muslims navigate, broadly speaking, between two moral frameworks. One is what I call, following Gilbert Hurt, the heterosexual family myth, and the second one, and I find this is often overlooked in research, is the gay hegemonic myth is one term that is used, or a homonormative moral framework. And I'm going to explain the second framework now. So coming out in the hegemonic and often white Euro-American sense of the word is a performative and verbal act, as speaking out one's sexuality is central. Now, before the 1960s, coming out entailed what nowadays is called coming in. So this means when one entered the LGBTQ scene. And in all other spheres of their lives, LGBT persons were generally closeted. Now, after the 1960s, coming out became a strategy to gain influence in the political sphere and also to build up a certain amount of self-confidence and self-respect. Now, speaking about the issue of gay or lesbian or bisexual identities within families was only conceivable during the past few decades because one did not speak of sexuality as an act, but because desire was now understood as something that is fixed and attached to a distinct identity. And that's what made it possible to speak about these identities within families. I would argue then that coming out is also part of a homonormative moral framework, which stresses public disclosure of one's sexuality as central to being true to oneself and others. And also that it's central to what it means to be properly gay. So this also entails a moral imperative, as coming out is equated with values such as honesty, truth, and authenticity. Now, in my view, there are three Northwestern cultural ideals which are also worth mentioning in this respect. The first one is that authenticity, being authentic, being yourself, leading a life that is true to yourself is highly esteemed as a cultural value, in my view. The second one is the importance of transparency. So everything, in ideological form, should be discussed openly. It should be transparent. Not a stone should be left unturned. Now, I have to stress the ideal aspect here. Most families, for example, do not sit around the table explaining sex to their teenage children. According to a Korean philosopher Han, transparency is one of the core cultural values in contemporary neoliberal capitalist society. And this insatiable need for transparency and the will to share everything takes place at the expense of other values, such as trust, secrecy, and shame, which are also important in the context of love, intimacy, and sexuality. Now, I do not entirely agree with his point, because I think that there are certain taboos concerning sexuality, gender, and the body that still regulate everyday life. If you think, for example, taboos surrounding menstruation, bodily excretions, certain illnesses such as mental illnesses, cancer, HIV/AIDS, also suicide, death, incest, certain bodily aesthetics, or certain sexual practices such as BDSM. So I think there are still a lot of taboos in society that regulate our everyday life. Another ideal, so that makes it four ideals actually, is that concerns prevalent uniromantic discourses that are used to convey feelings of love and sexual desire. And the dominant one in Belgian, and one could say by extension Euro-American cultural pattern, is organized around the notion of idealized love. And in this notion, public displays of affection, whether it's in behavior or speech, they are approved and even glorified, as long as such displays are not too overly sexual. Now, how do these hetero and homonormative moralities then inform the way queer Muslims navigate their sexuality in family networks? That's my next point. So the moment when one realizes that one has same-sex desires, these are very often considered as problematic by my participants, because one suddenly experiences a distance between who I am and who people think I am, or who people expect me to be. And my participants spoke of having led or of leading double lives, of being dishonest or hypocritical to people close to them about who they are. And one way to deal then with this dilemma, ethical dilemma, is then to come out, either privately to oneself or selectively to others. In many cases, the men and women I interviewed would first or only disclose their sexuality to their siblings. So I should say that they would first disclose to non-family members. So this can be LGBT friends, colleagues, schoolmates, but it would be first this category of people, and then they would move on to their family. And within the family, they would first tell this to their siblings or one of their siblings. One example is Jamila, who's a self-identified lesbian in her late 20s. And she recounted her first disclosure of her sexuality to her sister. Over the years, so Jamila and her sister had lived together in Antwerp, and they had shared a flat there. And from conversations they had in the company of other siblings, Jamila had this idea of which sibling was more open towards homosexual or same-sex sexuality than others. But during the years they lived together, Jamila did not have the courage to tell her sister, even though she completely trusted her. And she figured that her sister must have like an inkling, that she must know, because Jamila had brought like LGBT friends to their flat and introduced them. So she had dropped a lot of hints during those years. But it wasn't until they lived apart again that she actually mustered the courage to tell her sister. And again, it was really difficult for her, and she really had to push herself to do so. So during a telephone conversation, she said, like, there's something we need to talk about in person. And her sister just said, I know what it is. So after the telephone conversation, Jamila's sister texted her, and she wrote, I know it is sometimes difficult to talk about things, but you have to know that you can be yourself with me. I would not want it any other way. Whatever it is, and I think I know what it is, I accept you as a human being and as a sister, and you have my full support. So for many interlocutors or participants, their parents played an important role in their lives. And this is why disclosure to their parents was often the last to happen, if it happened at all. Now, when a person comes out to kinship relationships are put to the test. Disclosure, or coming out, undermines basic assumptions people have about blood ties or kin ties. Unconditional love, which is said to be central to the parent-child or sibling relationship, this may suddenly turn out to be conditional. Now, in my research, I found three, or I largely categorized them in three categories. So in the first category of narratives, queer Muslims decided not to perform disclosure to their parents. Now, especially as they got older and when they reached a marriageable age, this would become very difficult to avoid, and they would look for many strategies to avoid having to disclose their sexuality. One or a few strategies, for example, was while they were working, they would continue to study, for example, do another master, so they could say like, I'm way too busy to get married. Or they would move to another city or to live on their own, and this would give them a certain amount of leeway in how to negotiate their sexuality. And we've seen this in the example I gave, where Brahim says, where Muna says where she moved to a place of her own. Now, queer Muslims would not disclose their sexuality to their parents for a variety of reasons. For example, they said, I do this out of love and respect for my parents, or because that they feared that a coming out would disrupt their kin ties. Family was considered too important for their own well-being and happiness, and they thought that coming out or public disclosure would offer an impossible choice between family or sexuality. Other reasons that they mentioned were the parents' age. For example, if they were too old, it was deemed unnecessary, or the parents' general educational background or level of religiosity. For example, if the parents were considered too pious, they thought it was not a good idea to do a coming out. Also, another reason that was mentioned was that they said, at this moment I'm not in a long-term relationship, so it's not really necessary. Or they just didn't feel a need to tell them. For them it was just fine the way it was. Now, in a second category, where people have come out themselves, we can find a variety of tactics and terms that are used. In this category, I also found narratives where participants had given their parents clues, or they figured that they might tacitly know, or where they phrased it in more covered terms. So in such cases, everyone involved knew what not to know, or to use Michael Tausig's words, who's an anthropologist. For example, Brahim, as we've seen in the vignette, he said he would drop hints, like saying he would go to the Netherlands with a friend. Another example was a participant who's in his 30s, and his parents migrated from Turkey. And he had bought a house by himself, and he was working, and his parents wanted to present him with a marriage candidate from Turkey. He said, it's time for you to get married. And he sat his mom around the table, and he said, I don't know how you're going to react to this, but I don't like women. He didn't say, I don't like women, I like men. He just said, I don't like women. After which, for the parents, this was like a medical issue, like, that he had no sexual attraction to women. So they took him then to psychologists in Turkey, they took him to imams. And this was kind of a whirlwind for both of them, and he wasn't happy, and they noticed that the way they treated him wasn't making him happy, and after a few years they stopped asking about you should get married, and so a certain serenity grew around the topic. In the third category, queer Muslims were outed by someone or something else. I call this a mediated disclosure. For example, if your mother finds a flyer of an LGBT association in your room, if your dad discovers gay porn on the family laptop and stuff like that. So during fieldwork, I learned that, generally speaking, if queer Muslims decide to disclose their sexuality to their parents, this happens later than for LGBTs from the ethnic majority group. And often the parents are the last ones to know, if they find out at all. For the parents, a disclosure basically shatters the heterosexually family myth. Parents have to redefine the gendered expectations and idealizations they had about their child's future. So specifically, this means that they need to reframe their future perspectives of family and offspring. The parents' reactions and how they deal with their child's sexuality is often informed by translocal moralities concerning gender, sexuality, and kinship. For example, there was one participant whose mother hails from Morocco, and her mother never really reacted negatively to her daughter's sexuality. But every time she went to Morocco, she would consult an imam because she thought that her daughter was trapped, a man trapped in a woman's body, and that she was under a spell of black magic, and that she should undo this spell. So she then brought like an amulet home and asked her daughter to wear that. And her daughter had another view of, her sexuality, but still she was like, okay, I'll just wear this if this makes you happy, even though there wasn't really a conflict about it. So in families where sexuality is absent in everyday public moral discourse, it is difficult to speak of sexual identities, let alone sexual acts. So in such circumstances, coming out in the hegemonic sense of the word is neither feasible nor desirable. Queer Muslims constantly play with locking and unlocking the closet depending on the situation and the persons involved. From what I learned during fieldwork, the closet arises then as a morally dynamic, a fluid, dialogical, and powerful tactical space where the closeted person decides who to invite in. So instead of seeing disclosure and silence or coming out and non-coming out as complete opposites, it is better to speak of a continuum or a revolving door, to stay in the closet metaphor. Now, a persistent threat in the narratives were two things. On the one hand, the existence of a sort of tacit knowledge, and on the other hand, the existence or the importance of silence as a language. Now, let me first explain this concept of tacit knowledge. In a study of same-sex desire amongst immigrant Dominican men in New York City, Carlos de Sena starts from philosopher Michael Polanyi's work on tacit knowledge, which is defined as forms of expertise and ways of carrying oneself in the world that cannot be taught to others by way of verbal information exchange. So, not talking or speaking out, but intuitive and tacit knowledge, or in some cases, not knowing anything at all, seems the best option to negotiate one's sexuality within family networks. Sexuality in such cases is more a modality of doing than speaking. Speaking out publicly, so in the sense of making one's sexual subject position explicit, can be detrimental to kin relations. So I've talked a bit about this intuitive knowledge, but how do we understand then silence? And silence may be surrounded by a multiplicity of meanings and practices. So apart from tacit knowledge, silence, indirectness, and ambiguity are methods of conflict avoidance. In such cases, participants relied on statements that both reveal and conceal something at the same time. So I've given the example of a participant who said to his mother, I do not like women, but he purposefully not said that he likes men instead. In society at large, silence is often seen as a sort of absence or a lack. Anthropologist David Le Breton argues that silence is lauded in writing, in travelogues, it is valued in monastic communities and appreciated by those practicing meditation or engaging in prayer. However, in society at large or in general, silence reminds people of the night, of loneliness and death. And with the rise of modern technology, noise has become ever present in everyday life. In the narratives, I found that silence stands in contrast to discursive norms of coming out, and it may be seen as a language or the gulf between languages. In such cases, one's sexuality is not proclaimed, but carried. Another way of putting this, together with Eve Sedgwick, is how being closeted is, and I quote her, a silent speech act, a way of pointedly not saying something. Now I should stress, and this is really important, some find silence on the topic a perfect solution. But for others, there are limits to this strategy. As I said, as they get older, at some point the topic of finding a partner will become more pressing, particularly, as I've said, particularly when the parents present the participant with a suitable marriage candidate. Also, being in an intimate same-sex relationship raises new challenges in the negotiation of silence and disclosure. And we've seen this in Muna's case, who I mentioned in the beginning of my presentation, who said that her white Belgian partner does not understand why she just doesn't say to her parents that she's in a relationship with a woman. Now, we could also look at these practices of disclosure and non-disclosure in another way. Not coming out to their families, in the hegemonic sense of the word, can be seen, to paraphrase Leila Abu Lugot, as an active act of deference. In doing so, queer Muslims' negotiations of sexuality are not merely informed by heteronormative discourses and practices, but they are also active agents who reproduce and reinforce them. But precisely because they comply and confirm to these heteronormative discourses and practices, it is precisely because of this compliance that they can provide the room for maneuvering in which certain deviations can be enacted. So it's precisely because that they adhere to certain hegemonic norms that it allows them to subvert them in a way. Now, because of the hegemony and the persistence of the coming out model, it is understandable that other researchers stress how other modalities of the closet exist. And I agree that these alternative models or ways of coming out should be highlighted. However, some of the previous studies create a very particular view of the situation. Often, for example, there's a few researchers in the UK who specifically work with activists, and I think this creates a particular view of the situation. In my sample, if you will, there was more a variety in how the participants related to activism and LGBT associations. And I find that this previous research also risks to homogenize the experiences of queer persons of ethnic and racial minorities. As my research shows, not everyone was happy with this silence or tacit knowledge. For some, it took them years to adjust themselves to this state of affairs and to find a suitable modus vivendi. Silence around same-sex sexuality could also work in deafening and disheartening ways. Silence and a lack of even non-verbal recognition led towards estrangement and a rupture in kinship ties, as we've seen in Brahim's case, where he told us about his mother, where he looked for some recognition in her eyes, and this never happened. So taken together, These narratives ask us to reconsider hegemonic conceptualizations of coming out and the closet. They demonstrate in multiple and contrasting ways how the closet is not a monolithic space, and disclosure or public visibility is not a uniform process. So, I want to highlight a few of the things in which my study stands out from previous work. So, in contrast with earlier research, I stress that it is important to situate this negotiation of sexuality or this coming out process within heteronormative and homonormative moral frameworks. So parents and their queer children often draw upon different and sometimes contrasting moralities and notions concerning subjecthood, gender, and sexuality, and kinship. The ideas that parents entertained and the solutions they put forward to deal with their son or daughter's sexuality often relied upon what they were familiar with from the ancestral homeland. Also, I stress that within a context of migration, there are certain relationships of power which define which aspects of one's culture, religion, and tradition become highlighted or downplayed as a way of marking one's boundaries versus the ethnic majority group. So norms, values, practices, and discourses around sexuality and gender often play a crucial role in this ethnic and racial boundary-making process. So what I'm saying here is that my research stands apart in that it doesn't say that it only has to do the reactions of the parents or the way Muslims stress certain things as important to appropriate gender behavior. It doesn't necessarily only have to do with culture and tradition, but that it also has to do with precisely that context of migration. Also, my research distinguishes between the experiences of people of second and third generation and of people who migrated to Belgium themselves. Today I only talked about people from second and third generation, and I keep them analytically distinct in the most part of my book, because I also find that in previous research these experiences are often lumped together. And of course, being born in Belgium or moving there yourself makes your experiences around sexuality and gender and religion very different. Yeah, that's all I wanted to say about that. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. Absolutely fascinating. I'm sure we have in the select audience still ample questions. Can I invite?
That was really very interesting and surprising in some ways to me that in such a theoretically large field and coming at it from very different directions, we're using the same touchstones, people like Tosig and Abelagog and de Senna, which I think demonstrates actually that there is a limit to the literature in this area. But I was particularly interested in your concept of mediated disclosure, where people are outed by, in unintentional means. And I'm wondering whether or not this is genuinely accidental, because in my experience of working in the Middle East and trying to look at and understand people's sexual lives, it seems to me that this could be a strategy for not having to take responsibility, because they, it's something that they want to come out, but they're too afraid to do it themselves. So would you include within your mediated disclosure disclosure, these people where, you know, it would seem that perhaps this is perhaps, you know,
Mm.
a strategy rather than a genuine accident?
So I started from the way they talked about it during the interview and how they framed it. So there were people who deliberately like dropped hints to their parents, like the example I gave, where Jamila brought LGBT friends to their house and just introduced them as friends, or another participant who was like talking to people in his neighborhood, and he works as a social worker in an asylum center, and he would then say, you know, today I met a guy from Turkey and he migrated because of his sexuality, and then he would like look how everyone reacted to him telling that. Yeah, like some people would say, oh, that's a diabolical thing, or other people would say, oh, this is very tragic, so he could kind of know who to talk to about it. So that was very deliberate. But the people I put in the third category, they did not phrase it as something that they did deliberately, because the reactions they got were very bad. One guy who said that his mom discovered, so he borrowed his mother's camera and then he went to a party and he took pictures of him and his boyfriend kissing. He put them on his computer, but then forgot to erase the pictures, and then his mother saw the pictures, and his mom was like, oh, we need to have a conversation. I found your pictures. And his mother said, oh, I knew this all along. I mean, we kind of regret that this is the way it is, but you know, it's fine. But he said, you know, if she hadn't found this, I wouldn't have told her. So for him, it wasn't like a deliberate thing. Maybe we can read into that, like it's deliberate, but I always start from what my participants, how they frame it and how they tell me about it.
The categorization
Yes.
is actually in terms of their performance
Yes.
of disclosure rather
Yes.
than psychoanalyzing actually what...
No, I'm not. No, I'm not.
That's really
I don't go into speculation, but it could be maybe on a subconscious level. But yeah, some of the reactions were, I think, too horrific in these cases. Like there was one guy who surfed for gay porn on the family computer, and then the computer broke down, and his dad had to bring it to a friend to fix it. And then, of course, he discovered all this. What happened? And one morning, the participant came downstairs, and the whole living room was full of pictures from the websites. And there was a gun on the table, and his father was like, you know, if I discover you're gay, I'm gonna shoot you. And but that's a very extreme example. So yeah, it wasn't really a deliberate thing in these cases. But in the where they came out, I said that there are a variety of tactics and terms, and one of these tactics is doing it in this indirect way. Okay. Okay, thank you.
I was really happy to see that you put this homonormative framework as a really important parameter in your analysis. And I was also intrigued by the categories you came up with in our neoliberal global northern homonormative myth discourse, what we could say, yeah. So transparency, all these kind of things, yeah. One thing may be missing, and that comes to or not missing, but just not explicit, and I'm interested in your thoughts on that, is what I've called in recent publications homosecularism. This idea that if you are a member, a citizen, a sexual citizen of the liberal global north, you are almost obliged, homonormatively obliged, not to be spiritual or not to be religious. And if you have a religion, you have to have that in the most open societal ways, in the most relaxed forms of Christianity, the most relaxed forms of alternate spiritualities, many forms Buddhism, okay, many forms of New Age spirituality, okay. So then you're still a bit suspicious towards the homonormative man, because of this antithetical construction of religion and sexual diversity that we have in the neoliberal global north, and that we have. If you look at the research that looks at the development of LGBT rights, how it is always antithetically developed in America and in Europe, at contrasting to religious human rights or religious rights. So that was my one of my thoughts as well. Did you somehow include that, and what kind of stories can this tell? And that brings me to the other question. This is a series on Islam, social justice. You have a very clear anthropological migration view on that, and that's really fine. So my question is, where's the religion here? You know? Where's religion?
In another chapter.
Where's homosexualism? Where's the pressure to be queer in a secular way, to just put, because you were talking about more tradition and migration, and in a sense I'm fine with that, because critical religion sometimes gets rid of the term religion because it's useless, it's a Eurocentric invention, and then instead we talk maybe about cultural traditions and so on. And in that sense, okay, maybe we don't need to talk about religion or Islam.
No,
so if you can elaborate a little bit, I'm really interested.
Okay. Yeah, so my book falls into three parts, and the first part I focus on how they come out within kinship networks, so both in Belgium and transnationally. The second part I focus on migration, so people who migrate because of their sexuality, and I link this also to activism and how it is treated in the asylum procedure. But then in the third part I look at religion specifically. And here I look at the relationship queer Muslims maintain towards the Islamic tradition, and how this translates into everyday life. For example, for the persons from second and third generation, you see different relationships they have towards the Islamic tradition. For example, some identify as practicing Muslim, others more as cultural Muslim, then others see themselves as ex-Muslim, and then here you see different directions they take. They say I'm agnostic or atheist, or they engage in a form of spiritual seeking where they do a sort of religious bricolage. But then with the migrants, the majority is still identified as Muslim, and because they migrated, or through the migration process, this opened up more avenues to resources, to organizations that provide them with strategies to commensurate faith and sexuality. But what also came forward is that when people, like in the LGBT scene, when they say that they are Muslim or from Islamic background, they become a sort of suspect. Yes. And again, the reactions very much diverge. No, they're very different reactions anyway. For example, you have people who start saying you're a traitor, and you can't be gay and Muslim. This doesn't exist, or Islam forbids homosexuality. Others just ask like these benign, ignorant questions. Some participants, like who are white and Muslim, for example, from the Balkan, they will not say that they are Muslim, and they kind of pass as white, secular Belgium because of the color of their skin, and they really try to avoid that because they're fed up with being, asked constantly, like, so what? But what does your religion say about that? Because apparently every every white Belgian they meet is an expert on Islam and homosexuality. So they do brush against a lot of Islamophobia and cultural racism within the scene, and this is very problematic. And one of the important points that LGBT associations for ethnic and racial minorities were founded in Belgium is precisely to counter this kind of discrimination and racism. What else can I say about that? Yeah, that's it. I don't know if that answers your question.
Just makes me want to read your book now.
I hope so.
When's it being published?
Well, probably autumn next year.
And what's the title?
The title is the title of my talk. So, Queer Muslims in Belgium. This one. And it's a new series on gender and Islam. And I think this is the first one in that series. So, I think it will interest you as well. Yes.
Maybe another short question, if
Mhm.
you're still happy enough to answer.
Yes.
And that is, I was thinking about we're not only dealing with tacit subjectivities, but we're also dealing with different understanding of sexualities and gender, and the tension that the invention of homosexuality in the global north has versus the understanding of same-sex desires and practice than in other traditions. So when you first said that there was a tension about somebody surfing for gay porn, I thought, well, that shouldn't really be a problem. We all know that Pakistan and Saudi Arabia are rank 1 and 2 of the world's searches for gay porn, and from my understanding, I don't really think any male searching for gay porn would necessarily be stigmatized, because also of this understanding that if you're the penetrator, the active part in any kind of penetrative sex, it's not a question, you're not taking away from your masculinity, and the Eurocentric definition of homosexuality would not necessarily apply if the penetratee happens to be a man. So I was wondering, obviously now in a migration context, second, third generation, in Belgium, you have conflicting ideas about same-sex desires and how that is played out, and negotiated in the tacitity or not tacitity of queer identities. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think the problematic issue for the parents is precisely the naming.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it can exist, but you don't talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
It's precisely the talking about it which makes it problematic, because then you have to talk about it.
To reify it.
Yes, you reify it as something that exists,
Yeah.
but also sometimes it has to do with parents just not being familiar with this LGBT framework and these identities, or that it's something just so far removed from their everyday lives that they can't relate to that. But in the case of the guy searching gay porn, his mother was Belgian, and his father was from Tunisian origin. So his father was very, he knew what this stood for and stuff like that. But again, it's like in this particular instance, I think that precisely if he would tell his father that he was gay, then it would become problematic. Like, okay, he surfed, but this doesn't necessarily has to mean something in terms of identity for the father.
Exactly.
And that's why he gave the warning, like,
Right.
if you turn out to be gay, then then it's problematic for me. But where this was most salient and most clearly visible was actually for people seeking asylum. So for the sexual migrants, a large majority of the people I interviewed, they seeked asylum on grounds of sexual identity. And here they're like forced into this framework because they have to be very explicit to the Belgian Immigration Service about their sexuality, and they really have to use the categories LGBT. Otherwise, it's a bit suspect to the Belgian authorities. Like then they won't believe that they really are LGBTs. Like basically, you have to prove that you're LGBT. And for some, that's problematic because when they arrive in Belgium, they haven't sometimes not even heard about these categories, or it's just so new to them. Or they have heard about it, but for them it has a different meaning. For example, there was one guy whose application was denied, and the authorities said, you know, you're gay and Muslim, but you haven't really thought about this, and Islam forbids sexuality. And he had said this in his interview, you know, for me this is something different. I mean, I was born Muslim, I was born gay. This is something separate. But for them, they couldn't comprehend that he hadn't properly thought about a way to commensurate his faith and his sexuality, and that's why his application was denied. So just to say, like, you have these very different ideas, also sometimes within activist groups, you know, who have their own idea about what LGBT means versus what the migrant thinks about it. For example, there's one conversation which always stuck with me, where social workers of an asylum center we were in the LGBT Rainbow House, and they were talking about an asylum seeker, and they thought she was transgender, and they were like, you know, he wears nail polish, and his hair is very effeminate, so he must be transgender then, even though the asylum seeker, him or herself, did not really use this term. So there's this need to put people into categories, otherwise you become a bit morally suspect.
Without any recognition that these people don't necessarily share the same terms of reference.
Yeah, or they might recognize it, that sometimes they share the same term of reference, but it doesn't really have this like the same content. And like they can have a slightly different idea. Like participants would often say that to me, you know, I'm gay, but I think I have a different idea than what you think that gay is, you know. And I was like, yes, explain. So
I guess that's a part of the tension that I was looking at. It was really interesting to see your findings there. I mean, did you come across that people saying, well, for me being gay means I'm the passive partner in a same-sex relationship, because that is something that you find, for instance, in the Middle East.
yeah, I know.
But that is not something that you found in
No.
So
I mean, like through participants, I heard, for example, of men that were married and would only have sex with other men, like outside, like they were closeted, but I wasn't able to interview them. And maybe in these cases, you can find people who more identify in that way. Yeah.
any more questions? Well, I really enjoyed it. Nobody else wants to. Give a big hand of applause. Thank you so much.
Thank you.